All right. Hello. Uh, Welcome. We are very sorry that we're running a little late, but very excited to get this started. So I'm going to assume that we're good unless I hear anything else from our tech folks. All right. Hi, everybody out there in the economy world. We're really thrilled to have people joining us from around the country, around the continent, and around the world. I'm very sorry about our delay here. We were having some technical difficulties, so I already did a whole introduction once, but it was practice, so I get to do it again now with y'all. It looks like we're on and running, so that's really exciting. This conversation has been something I've been looking forward to quite a bit, and I know that there's a great amount of interest around the country for this, so I'm excited to get us going. So let me just first introduce myself. My name is Aaron Tanaka. I'm representing a few organizations based here in Boston. One is the Center for Economic Democracy. Another is called the Boston Impact Initiative, which is a place-based impact investment fund. And finally, I'm the very proud co-chair of the New Economy Coalition, which is hosting this very exciting week of events and activities around the country, celebrating and highlighting the new economy movement that's growing across the continent. So we're really excited to have you all here, and we have some very exciting guests who are going to be speaking to us about some innovations in the worker co-op world. Before I introduce them and get into our conversation, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. So the main thing is that this is going to be hopefully a participatory conversation. We want to invite you all out there to ask your questions or bring some comments into the discussion. And so to that end, there should be a chat box next to the video that you are currently watching that you can type into. Or you could also tweet us questions or comments and use the hashtag #NewEconomyWeek. And Mike, the New Economy Coalition's coalition coordinator, will be fielding questions and passing them on to me throughout the conversation. We'll be doing some presentations for the first maybe 25 minutes, and then we'll use the remaining hour to have a more open discussion that'll include questions from y'all, questions from myself, and questions between the panelists potentially as well. All right, so with that being said, I would like to introduce our two panelists, and then we'll get us going with the first question. So our first panelist is going to be Kristen Baker. Kristen is with the Cincinnati Union Cooperative Initiative, based in Cincinnati, and is also one of the co-founders of One Worker, One Vote. And they're going to be having a very exciting conference this next weekend, or this coming weekend, really highlighting and building out the strategy of integrating cooperatives with cooperatives with the union structure. And I think what's really exciting about this piece is just that both of these entities, co-ops and unions, have been working to empower workers, increase the living standards and wages for us to take back our labor and the value that we create. But these two models have not always been aligned. And so what's, I think, incredibly exciting is to see the work that's happening in this conference and folks around the country who are starting to integrate and build off of the strengths of both these movements to build sort of a new model of a worker-owned union cooperative. And so Kristen will come back to you in a second. But first, let me also introduce Nathan Schneider. Nathan is a prolific, progressive writer who's been published in lots of our favorite magazines and journals around in the country. And he's also one of the driving forces behind Platform Cooperativism, which is a conference that will be taking place in New York City also this weekend. And I think the question of platform cooperativism is a relatively new conversation. I was first exposed to it from one of my colleagues, who is also the co-chair of the New Economy Coalition, Leah Hunt Hendricks, who I believe has worked with Nathan and actually published a set of pieces in The Nation, I think in May of this year, drawing out some of the possibilities, the questions that are really embedded in our conception of what our strategy is as we are moving into economy in which the sharing economy is all the rage. So for example, the way I've been describing this, maybe overly simplistically, is we have Uber, and there's lots of things that people like about them, but we know that Uber is not extracting tons of value from the capital and the labor that the drivers are providing in. And so what would a worker-owned Uber platform look like? And so Nathan, I'm sure that you'll give us a lot more nuance and texture to the conversation, but that's part of why we're so excited here. So both of these speakers are speaking to innovations in the worker co-op sector. I think, Kristen, before we go to you, let me just do a quick thing just to define what a worker co-op is. one thing that I was saying in our first attempt at this introduction was this is not a Worker Co-op 101 webinar. We do assume that folks on this have a general sense of what a worker co-op is and generally are supportive of the idea. And so we're not trying to sell you on why worker co-ops and democratic workplaces ought to be and should be the future of labor. But really what we're asking is what are the innovations and the movement strategies that are emerging. So before we have you talk about union co-ops, Kristen, let me just say really briefly, so for those who don't know what a worker-owned business is, a worker-owned cooperative is, it is kind of exactly what it sounds like. In a traditional business, you have an owner who often hires employees. Employees work, they get paid a wage or a salary, and any of the profits that are left over at the end of the year get distributed back to the owners. Now, those owners might be a sole proprietor, for example. Owners might be shareholders. But either way, typically the workers, particularly in working class and entry level, for example, work, that those workers do not have stock options, they do not have employee ownership, so they don't benefit in the profits that they are primarily responsible for helping generate. And so worker co-ops come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They can be anywhere from a couple individuals all the way to probably the best known cooperative in the world is the Mondragon Cooperative based in Spain, in which it's actually a network of worker-owned businesses that includes over 200, I believe, and 50 small worker-owned businesses employing over 80,000 people, is one of the top 10 largest corporations in Spain. And so there's a whole range of internal management, democratic practices. Sometimes you have flat organizational structures. Other times workers are electing their management. And so those are questions that anyone who's into co-ops has probably delved into, and some of those things will be relevant in the conversations you guys are having. But for us, the question is, how do we take this basic principle of one worker, one vote, of democratic ownership and control, and apply them to adapt to the economy, the sort of political situation that we live in, and how to make this model more relevant and impactful and inclusive of people that really deserve and need this kind of worker ownership the most. So I hope that's a sufficient sort of example or explanation at some level of what a worker-owned co-op is. And with that, I would like to turn to you, Kristen. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we do that, I also want to recognize that Carmen Huertas-Noble, who is one of your colleagues, one of the co-founders of One Worker, One Vote, and at CUNY School of Law, was going to join us, but unfortunately she is feeling sick today, and so sends her regards. And so, Kristen, thank you for holding the space for both of you, but just wanted to make sure to shout out Carmen. So with that, we'd love for you if you could just describe to us in your own words, what is a union worker co-op? Kristen.
Oh wait, I see I have to unmute myself. There we go. It's a great question, and I think what brought us in Cincinnati into this movement was, as you mentioned, Mondragon. We are very excited by the scale of Mondragon and the fact that they were able to really, truly transform a whole region or area of Spain from poverty, unemployment, to nearly full employment in about 20 years. And that's the kind of scale that we want to see. We want this to occur throughout the United States. So when Mondragon made the historic partnership in 2009 with the steelworkers to launch union co-ops here, we got really excited because we thought, all right, here's the proven model, and they're adapting it to the American culture by including labor. And labor has an incredible network, and there's an incredible inherent ability to scale there. So that kind of that's what we got excited. This got announced in October of 2009. We really studied it. We tried to see what this model really meant because we weren't familiar with it. So we were somewhat familiar with the worker-owned model, and as you all know, we have about 400 worker-owned co-ops in the United States, so relatively pretty small, with incredible potential for growth. I think this is an awesome time for that, but we were wondering, like, why don't we have a whole lot more co-ops? And as we looked at this, we thought this might be one of the models that could help accelerate the growth of worker ownership. And part of it isn't just a connection of the union piece, but just the way that Mondragon develops into that integrated network that you talk about, creating that ecosystem, that network, that integrated network of co-ops that helps to buffer when there are downturns in the economy, that is multi-sectoral, that's really based on solidarity. And when that solidarity arrangement and deep interconnectedness that they have, including giving 10% of their profits to the larger whole that gets funneled back into growth, education, etc., really taps into the labor movements, the best practices of the labor movement solidarity base. But one of the other things that Mondragon realized to be successful is that you have to keep as many pathways as possible for worker participation. And what they found in their own co-ops is that when you got to about 50 workers, there began to be a disconnect between people on the shop floor and people that, I guess I should just look at myself. I keep looking at you, Aaron, but I'll look at myself, I guess. Anyway, that there's a disconnect between people on the shop floor and people in management. And that disconnect just grows. And even though people have the ability to, let go of their managers once a year, and even though there's all kinds of things in place, there still wasn't enough input flowing through the company, so that Mondragon there was even a strike in the 70s. And after that, they doubled down on a concept called the social council, which is this defined place where people can, it's just a defined place where people can handle conflicts that arise, where management can communicate, where workers have a really clear channel to make sure all of their ideas and input into management is flowing. So this was something they found that was like creating, in some ways, a redundant structure to just make sure everyone's voices are heard. So when you come to the United States, that social council could take the form of a union co-op, a union committee rather. Mm-hmm. So that within a union committee, within a union co-op, you have you've got a board of directors, you have all the worker owners who elect those board of directors, but you also have these worker owners that select a union committee. And it gives you even more, sort of more assurance of transparency, participation. It also gives protections to workers, because at least for us, we have a 1-year orientation or probation period before you become a worker owner. So you are part of the union from the get-go, or in some cases after 90 days. And so you have some protection right away, even before you're a worker owner. So it's a really exciting model. We've brought it to life in Cincinnati, and it's coming to life in a number of cities across the country right now. And I don't know how much you want me to say about that at this time, or if it's time to hear from Nathan.
Can you just share a example of one worker union co-op that you guys have done, and then we'll come back to the
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm just going to name 2 quick examples. So the first one we launched was called it's Our Harvest, and it's a worker-owned farm and food hub. So we grow food, we aggregate food from other local growers, and we also help train new farmers. And then we launched Sustainergy, which is this construction co-op, and we are launching Apple Street Market, which is a full-service worker and community-owned grocery store that should open next summer. We just hired our general manager. It's in a food desert in Cincinnati, and we're really excited about that.
Oh, that's really exciting. Just on that last piece, I think there's some amazing sort of community-owned grocery store efforts. I know of the one in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the Renaissance Community Cooperative, which sounds like a very similar project. So that's really cool to hear.
Really awesome.
What are the unions that y'all are working with in these 3 different co-ops?
So the steelwork, in the ones I just mentioned, United Food and Commercial Workers represents the workers that are in Our Harvest and in the grocery store. IBEW and the insulators represent the ones in our energy retrofitting co-op. But across the country, CWA has union co-ops, the UE has union co-ops. The largest worker-owned co-op in the United States, which has been around for 30 years, is in the Bronx Cooperative Home Care Associates, and they have SEIU 1199. The steelworkers are involved. There's a lot of different ones when we broaden out. The Teamsters.
Great. Awesome. All right, thank you, Kristen. So yeah, that's a really exciting development that's been happening. I remember when, oh, do you mind muting yourself just a minute?
Oh, right. Sure.
Thank you. I remember when that steelworker partnership with Mondragon was introduced, and I think a lot of us around the country were really excited to see where that would go. And so it's amazing to see some of the new developments that are happening and work on the ground folding out. So thank you for sharing that and giving us the basic introduction. So we'll come back to you in a little bit. But now I want to pivot over to Nathan. So Nathan, if you could kind of do the same thing of like, you know, I think the term platform cooperativism is still something that's relatively new. And you know, the reality is that a lot of our sort of sharing economy tools as a whole is also relatively new. And so I understand that there's some really great thinking going into strategizing on how to take advantage of some of the benefits that technology offer, but understanding that technology and these platforms are political. And we're also trying to deal with the trajectory of increasing contingent workers, people who are not working full-time, who don't have benefits. And so I know that a lot of your efforts are trying to help reform and sort of retake the sharing economy so that it's truly in service of people. So give us a sort of general outline of what y'all are looking at when you talk about union cooperatives. I'm sorry, cooperative platforms.
Sure, thanks, Aaron.
Yep.
You know, I come at this as a writer initially, and you know, like a lot of reporters interested in tech and the economy, about a couple of years ago, I started getting involved in reporting on and engaging in the discussion about this sharing economy. And as a writer, too, I started noticing some weird stuff about how people are using words. And this goes back a long time, but is really manifest in the question of sharing. You know, it was the definition of what was being shared when we talk about Airbnb and Uber is very, very narrow. Like, you're sort of, but mostly sharing, but mostly renting your apartment or car. And this word starts to take on a different meaning than we're used to having, maybe in a community setting, in a democratic setting, in you know, a kid's playground. Sharing means something very different, and this is a process with a history. You know, you look at the word democracy. When you look up how people use democratizing or democratize in internet culture, it's very weird. People only mean access. They only mean expanding access to something. It never means any of the stuff that actually we tend to identify with democracy, stuff like ballot boxes and accountability and you know, even a kind of shared ownership. Right. And so that just kind of obvious transformation of language happening before our eyes got me, and I think a lot of other people, thinking about, you know, what if this were a real sharing economy? What if the democratizing that Silicon Valley and that the platforms that it represents were doing were actual democracy? What if we brought these old definitions back? And platforms are increasingly driving our economy. These sometimes we experience them as websites, sometimes we experience them as apps. Really what they are is just like centers of power and data and information about us that increasingly determine how we work, how we interact with our friends and family, how we get around. And it's really important, if we think of ourselves as a democratic society, that we find some ways to truly democratize these platforms and even explore what that means. And it's kind of amazing how little we've done that so far. So in order to kind of jog my thinking about this, I started spending a lot of time in the cooperative world, getting to know people at worker cooperatives, cooperative developers, people thinking about financing, you know, because this is the part of the economy, this is the way of doing economy that really does involve democracy and really does involve sharing. So it just seems like the obvious place to turn. And, you know, you can go as far back as, you know, ancient tribes and monasteries in the industrial age, something like Mondragon you mentioned. I also had the chance to report on a network also in a separatist region of Spain in the Barcelona area called the Catalan Integral Cooperative, which kind of blends the idea of like the freelancers union, this network of independent workers, and cooperative ownership. So I started seeing some new things emerging, and then also started looking to the ways in which tech culture itself has also carried these cooperative ideals with it. And we have to recognize that even with this incredible centralization and monopolization of platforms that we're seeing right now, tech culture has also brought us open source software and Wikipedia, really interesting forms of social organization within workplaces like holacracy and lean, agile software development, techniques of collaboration that are really very participatory and offer some opportunities for democratic practice. And then also kind of crazy new technologies like the blockchain that powers Bitcoin, which could be a very scary technology in many ways, but also could open up some really interesting possibilities. And so I started looking for the projects where people were trying to do this real democracy and this real sharing, and started finding them. For instance, started finding people exploring open source social media networks where people retain control over their data. As Uber came up, I think it was actually a kind of watershed, because it made very clear for many people that this sharing economy game was not happening. It wasn't sharing. The language started shifting to on demand, and it really pushed a lot of people into thinking about what real sharing could look like. So there have been a number of efforts to develop cooperative cab companies, something that would do what Uber does so well, the convenience, the app-based interface with some real worker rights built in. Also, marketplaces, alternatives to Amazon and that sort of thing, where the sellers co-own the platform. Data cooperatives, where people control how their data is monetized rather than just handing it over to these very centralized monopolistic companies. And as I started seeing how people are experimenting, on the one hand, it became very clear that we need to bring these worlds together. We need to bring the offline experience of labor organizing and cooperative development and financing onto the internet. It's way overdue. We just really need to start figuring out how to build platforms cooperatively and share ownership in real ways. But on the other hand, I think also we have to allow for the possibility of the development of the cooperative tradition. A lot of these experiments in cooperative platforms that are out there don't really fit easily into the mold of a worker cooperative or a producer cooperative or consumer cooperative or a credit union. They're often a kind of blend of those things, in the same way as Facebook and Uber blur the line between worker and consumer. So there's an interesting dynamic where there are possibilities of real interesting innovation, but there's also a real important need to stick to the real fundamental principles of the cooperative tradition of shared ownership, of democratic practice, one worker, one vote, all these things. And just imagine how some of the most contentious debates that we have about the internet today, stuff like the sharing economy on the one hand, but also stuff like surveillance. How would this be different if we were dealing with cooperative platforms? Would we be able to prevent the kind of surveillance that we've been seeing if we could vote for the board of directors of Facebook or Google? How would that change the conversation? Would we be able to pivot it in a different way? And I think that all these kinds of possibilities open up. And a key question too is and this comes up when we think about cooperativism anywhere, is are we talking about just replacing what we've already got with cooperative alternatives? Are we talking about really rethinking the way the economy is structured, and recognizing what an incredible transformation it is to inject true democracy into how we do business?
Thanks, Nathan. Great sort of introductory discussion, and you're starting to just, for me, the synapses are firing to think about the possibilities, and I appreciate you framing this not just about replacing individual businesses, but what's the logic of our core economy and what role do everyday people have in controlling the services and the goods that we use on a regular basis? What role do workers and laborers play in that question? So yeah, it's a really rich sort of set of questions and strategies that are getting brought forward. So I do want to start putting us all in conversation with each other, but before we do that, I did want to first ask each of you now to share a little bit about the two conferences that y'all are both organizing. Would love to hear, Kristen, from you. Describe the conference, who's going to be there, but also like talk to us about what the hopes of this conference is from a strategic standpoint. Like, what are some of the core, maybe the questions or the challenges that y'all are trying to figure out as you bring all these people together? And then Nathan, I'll come to you with the same question. Oh, all right.
Can you do Nathan? Oh, there we go. So I'm borrowing this office, and apparently I wasn't moving enough, and it must be a very, I don't know, the light went out. So, all right, so our conference in Cincinnati, the Union Co-op Symposium, we're bringing together people from Mondragon to share their experiences with us. We're bringing people from about 20 different states together who are either currently creating these union co-op initiatives in union co-ops or who are wanting to get involved. They come from all different places. They come from labor backgrounds, community organizing, business backgrounds. Some of them are part of worker-owned co-ops right now. They come from banks and CDFIs. All kinds of people are coming, all different ages, all kinds of folks. So worker centers, I'm quite excited by the group of people that's going to be descending on Cincinnati shortly, it is remarkable that we have these two awesome conferences are happening on exactly the same days. This Friday, November 13th, and Saturday, the 14th. What our goals are many. So one of them is that we just want to really strengthen this union co-op movement. We want to bring together people who are experimenting with it so that we can all escalate and strengthen and accelerate those efforts. So there's a lot of focus in here. Each session is very participatory, how they're designed, so that we form deeper connections, really get to know one another better, so we can share information and so forth, and build that connectivity. Some people are coming with all different knowledge bases. Some people are really wanting some of the just real practical, how do you run this business, what are key insights, how do you build that co-op culture, how do you really focus on education. How do you access capital? So there's sort of practical things related to all of those pieces. And then there's also really listening, like how do you take the idea to the business? How has Mondragon been successful for that? What are some of those key insights? What has been the experience or the heart of the principles? So we'll get to hear from key folks there. But then there's all kinds of other things. I mean, there's actual initiatives that are launching at this event, partnerships that are coalescing, that'll be announced as a result of it. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really excited by the diverse group of people that'll be here. My only sadness is that it's at the exact same time as this awesome other conference. But there are so many parallels and exciting things, and it is cool because, oh darn it, hold on. I don't know how, oh there.
There you go.
There we go. So I'm just going to give it to you before the light goes out again, Nathan.
Awesome. Great, thank you. Go ahead, Nathan.
All right, well, again, yeah, it really is a shame that this is happening at the same day. You know, O'Reilly out in Silicon Valley is doing a big on-demand economy conference the same weekend, and we were really excited. You know, we're the kind of counter-revolution, right? And we were really into that idea of competing with them in some way, but now we're finding ourselves overlapping with a conference that a lot of us would really love to be at. And really these conversations should come together. One of the things really exciting about the platform cooperative efforts is that several of them are union-driven, and we're seeing that as one of the major business models and strategies for doing this. So there really is some synergy here, and it's a shame that we're not going to be together. And that's why this conversation right now is so important, I think. The story of how this conference emerged was first through myself and Trevor Schultz, who had been organizing a series of conferences on the challenges of digital labor. Both published articles at the end of last year exploring this question of shared ownership of online platforms. I had been to his last conference. I was very much informed by that. And we just realized, we were kind of on the same page here and started collaborating. We held a public event in New York and started having meetings with a small working group with the idea maybe we'll connect some people, in that case, people who were doing labor organizing and people who wanted to build some apps. And we were trying to kind of strategically bring them together. And more we just saw people interested in this and decided to use Trevor's next conference slot to explore this idea further. And we thought, we'll bring together, a few co-op developers, a few tech people, a few labor people, and just see what happens, have some nice informal conversations. And suddenly the interest just blew up. And we've got ourselves in a situation where we have more than 1,000 people registered. Some of the afternoon slots, we only have room for about 200 people. So we'll see how that goes. It might be a bit of a spectacle. My wife keeps saying, "Why didn't you charge for this? Why didn't you charge for this?" But fortunately, as this grew, we got some support from organizations that are involved in this ecosystem and want to see it grow. We've also been kind of amazed to see several CEOs, founders of Meetup.com and Zipcar coming along, a leading venture capitalist, the chief technology officer of New York City, a city council member from the Bronx who's been supporting worker co-op legislation in the city, and entrepreneurs from around the world, all kind of feeling this sense that this convergence needs to happen somehow. I think a lot of us don't really know how it's going to happen exactly, but we want to come together and start working on it. One of the things that was really important to us from the beginning is to show some of the possibilities at play. And this is a little risky because a lot of these things are new, but we wanted to show that this is already happening. And so kind of the centerpiece, one of the centerpieces of the event is a series of showcases where we're just going to have short engaging pitches from the heads of these projects. For instance, Stocksy is a photo syndication service that's owned by its photographers, kind of in the tradition of Magnum. Loconomics, which is a job marketplace owned by its workers, kind of like TaskRabbit, starting up in San Francisco. And then, for instance, something like Fairmundo, which is a Amazon-like marketplace for goods that is being run out of Germany. And many others. Another thing that we're really emphasizing is the infrastructure. We don't think this is a matter of just a killer app. Uber didn't come to be just because it's a great idea. It came to be because there was financing, a lot of financing, because there was business support, because there was a whole kind of cultural and economic infrastructure that enabled that to happen. So I think we need to be thinking structurally and systemically, as the cooperative movement already is in some really important ways. And so as I go into this conference with lots of people coming from a lot of different corners, there are a few things that I'm really trying to keep in mind. One is to really focus on ownership and governance, not let the conversation morph into that access, which I think is so easy in tech world. The other is that question of ecosystem, not apps. We want to celebrate the apps that are starting to emerge, but we want to emphasize that it's not just a dude with a great idea that makes things happen. It's a whole structure and a system that we need to build. Another thing is that we want to avoid solutionism. We want to recognize that I think a lot of people see that the economy is broken, and they want like tech culture inclines us to want one fix for everything. And we want to really emphasize that cooperativism can be flawed too. And we have to think of this as a journey and as a process not as a final solution of some sort. And also that it's a horizon, not an absolute. You know, the idea of a fully cooperative online platform, you know, it might take more work to build, to scale something like that up. There are still a lot of question marks about how to implement this. And so I think even while emphasizing ownership and governance, we need to make sure that we're open to exploring hybrid forms, ways of expanding worker ownership and participant ownership, and you know, being tolerant of the kind of the uphill battle that people are facing here. But you know, most of all, this conference is an invitation. When it's over, I'm going to come back to Colorado, where I'm living now, and I'm going to try to see if we can get some projects off the ground and build a kind of cooperative tech ecosystem here. And I hope that lots of people who come to platform cooperativism will do the same.
Awesome. Thanks, Ethan. You raised some really great questions, and the conference itself also sounds really amazing. Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of a shame that these are happening at the same time, but it's also amazing to me, right? Because it's just, I think, speaking to sort of the, I mean, I'm relatively new to this sector in terms of cooperatives, probably only been involved, you know, 8-10 years or so. But it seems like there's a new energy happening, and I do think part of the spirit that both of you are bringing is this idea that there's not a single solution, and that we need to be adapting and relevant to the political and economic conditions that are surrounding us. And so what's also really exciting is how these different things might start to intersect also. So I want to dig into that a little bit. So just as a time check, we're going to go till 4:45. We're going to run this for the whole hour. I want to ask you all a couple questions, and then after that we'll leave at least 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more for folks who are sending questions. And we're already starting to get some good ones in, so feel free if you're out there and you want to add. So I think both of you have spoken to the idea of the cooperative ecosystem, that it's not simply that, oh, we have a good idea and that's going to change everything. I mean, we do need the good ideas, but to me it almost feels like the ideas have been articulated. You know, there's a beautiful sort of chart of what a union cooperative can look like. You know, we have working examples and models of platform cooperatives. And so to me, I think the broader question around the ecosystem is one of the things that would be really helpful from your vantage point to just speak to briefly. And so I was wondering, you know, I was with some folks from the Democracy at Work Institute and with Project Equity, and they're holding a co-op ecosystem conversation in the Bay Area. And we're starting to ask us, you know, what are some of the capital challenges and the opportunities that relate to, you know, scaling and building out these particular models? Where's the appropriate technical assistance? The reality is that this stuff is not easy, and so particularly if we want to be inclusive about who we're including as worker owners in this world, that we need to make sure that we have relevant and robust technical assistance. And then I would also raise a question about what is the role of the broader movement for economic and social justice, and how does that relate to some of the policy levers that also might help create some space? One of you were speaking about how do you buffer, Kristen, I think you were saying, how do we buffer these businesses from the market, the capitalist economy that we exist in? And the reality is that many of the multinational corporations that are making you know, lots and lots of money at the expense of their workers, they benefit from concrete tax structures, from policies that privilege them and really rig the big guys to be successful against the little ones. And so I would love for both of you maybe to speak about, you know, maybe not all three of them, but you know, where's the thinking around capital, technical assistance, and movement and policy? And so just as an example, like I would be curious, Kristen, like I know that the unions have pension funds, for example, and I know that there's always been this question in movement spaces around how are those investments being related to our social justice work. And so I'm curious whether that might be a source that this new union cooperative movement is creating space for more alignment between the funds that are coming from workers and currently sometimes being invested in you know, things that are against our principles, and instead aligning them to our own ecosystem that we're trying to build. So you don't have to speak to that specifically, but that's an example of some of the questions that I would have. So could we start with you, Kristen?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
So all of those are really good questions, and I'm really echoing. Is that true for everyone, or just me? Just me. Okay. So so those are all great, and one of the things that I think that excites me as this picks up steam is that I think different financial products become available
Okay, Nathan, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Oh wait, Kristen, I'm sorry, you broke up for a second. Can you just say that last thing again?
Starting the whole last thing?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sure. Okay, so good questions. And so what I was just saying is that in terms of capital, for example, I think, as I mentioned before, there's 400 or something, maybe there's 500, I don't know, worker-owned co-ops throughout the entire United States, so a really small sector. So in terms of creating financial instruments, capital instruments for us to tap into, there's not much of a market for those right now. So as we build them up in Cincinnati, and as they're being built up throughout the country in all different places, as every different part starts to rise, then new opportunities begin to open up. So something that, and so when you talk about pension funds, for example, something about those, there's really significant fiscal fiduciary responsibilities. And so, for example, investing in a startup isn't necessarily a good choice for that because of the risk of failure. Like 80% of startups fail within 5 years. But it might be a really good thing for a conversion of some kind where you've got a demonstrated record, and that could be excellent. And so there's all kinds of discussions going on in the labor movement about that and about using ESG screens when they are making their investments. So I think there is room, or there's room potentially in investing in real estate. So they've done that for years and years in terms of building trade projects, but potentially investing in farmland or investing in factories or grocery stores or something. I mean, I think there's room there, but I'm interested to see what happens. Mondragon made a historic partnership with Laboral Cucha. So Mondragon. Mondragon's bank is called Laboral Cucha. They made a historic partnership with the National Cooperative Bank. So they're united and they're working on certain projects in the United States together. They'll all be at the Union Co-op Initiative. And as I said, I think as we are all across the country, able to create more successful worker-owned co-ops, I think that partnership could manifest in exciting ways in the future. I think there's all sorts of work that happens, like in Cincinnati. I mean, in the Bay Area or in New York or whatever, you create these local ecosystems with your CDFIs, your Community Development Financial Institute. They play a critical role for us with credit unions, etc. But I am interested in the kinds of national tools that can emerge. And we're kind of seeing that in terms of education, which is another one of your questions. Mondragon University made a partnership with CUNY Law to launch, and it's happening right now in New York. It's a co-op development certificate, and that's going to ideally become available in the next few years throughout the United States. But meanwhile, when you talk about, I love your question about technical assistance and accessibility and creating true options for participation from people from all walks of life, that is a huge, huge value for us in Cincinnati. And we utilize this curriculum. We've created super participatory, but we meet with Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative, meets with our worker owners and our workers, with each group of them every week. It's all participatory. We use the great game of business. We do nonviolent communication, all this communication stuff. It's bilingual. We have people that haven't graduated from high school. We have new immigrants. We have people with master's degrees. So we've got this incredible mix. We have people that English isn't their first language, and it's a pretty useful way of working with folks to kind of open it up and make it possible for everyone to really dig in and participate and understand what's going on. I could go
Awesome,
on.
thanks.
I'll try
Yeah,
to stop.
no, that's so exciting. I love it. I really hope that y'all will be able to share out some of the conversations and learnings that you do have at this conference, because the stuff you're talking about, I think for many of us, is like you're right at the cusp of, it seems like some breakthroughs in terms of our national infrastructure that could really help scale and move the field in this way. And so it's just really amazing work. Cool. So Nathan, let me kick that back to you also. So
Yeah.
sort of this broader question on ecosystem, and I've seen some of your writing that speaks to some of this, so looking forward to hearing some of your quick thoughts.
Sure. One piece that I think is so important is culture. It's so striking to me that you walk into your average like tech company, walk into the Googleplex, and you have all these people doing participatory projects, basically practicing some kind of democracy and how they operate often. But there's a firewall between that and ownership and the core governance of the business. And I think we need to shift our culture in such a way so that we feel like we can own the stuff that and govern the companies that affect our lives. And that doesn't mean that we have to be there at every meeting and everything has to be decided by consensus, but that we feel confident that we can create common sense structures for governing our enterprises, because we already do pretty well at governing ourselves in project groups and things like that, and tech culture has demonstrated that. I think we need a sense of confidence first, but then there's a lot of other stuff. The tech industry, that question of startups that Kristen mentioned, this is the problem of the tech industry, is it's built on a model of high risk, rapid growth, highly leveraged business models in which basically if you're taking venture capital, your only goal in most cases is an exit, is selling to Wall Street or selling to a company that's already publicly traded or larger in some way. And so there's this automatic drive toward capitalization, toward driving the business toward capital rather than toward people's needs, meeting needs, which is the foundation of cooperative ownership. And this is a really hard question. It's a really hard challenge, and we need more creative thinking. In some cases, actual venture capitalists who are interested in this are looking to diversify their portfolios, and they're seeing opportunities for different kinds of business models that could be slower growth, lower risk, that would be better suited to a more distributed financing model, and that might be where we have to look. Another thing is to really up our game in terms of the crowdfunding movement. Right now crowdfunding is basically like advanced buying or donating, right? It's not real investing. And the Jobs Act creates some opportunities for more distributed investing, but I think we need more tools for a truly kind of crowd-financed platform that can become an alternative to venture capital. I also think that the state is really important. Governments at different levels need to be a part. We're really, for this conference, looking at New York City. What can New York City do to be to use the Belgian theorist Michel Bauwens' term, a partner state? What can it do? I think some examples, for instance, are supporting with financing. In Europe, where there's less venture capital available, states are much more a part of financing the tech sector, and they provide much more amenable terms, like large, low interest loans without equity involved. There are some real opportunities there for government to step in. Another case is preferential use of research IP. A lot of by IP, I mean intellectual property. A lot of the tech industry right now is built on government-funded research, and all the profits are going into private hands. So maybe cooperatives should have preferential access to that IP. Another thing is we need more legal structures for mass co-ownership that can transcend states and even states in the United States and also countries, so that people all over the world can co-own platforms together, and that's going to be a challenge. Another opportunity, and this might be the more controversial, is I think it's time to get more serious about breaking up the existing monopolies and converting their constituent parts into cooperatives. When virtually everybody is relying on Google as their search tool and so much else, I think that's a real problem. It's a problem that should be identifiable in our legal system, and I think we should put pressure on states to break these monopolies up and democratize these businesses. That creates an opportunity for technical assistance. The things I hear most from our platform co-op friends is the need for access to legal structures and guidance on how to build these businesses. It's just so much easier to start a more conventional extractive business. So we need to institutionalize the support, institutionalize the legal advice so that people know who to turn to if they want to build a democratic online platform. And then, also participatory governance tools. And this is an area that's really expanding. Tools like Lumio and Democracy OS are making it easier for large numbers of people to make decisions together. And I think we need to continue to develop that space and train more people in how to use it.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, this conversation is not long enough. So we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface. I hope folks are enjoying getting to hear some of the things that our leaders here are thinking about and talking to folks about. I just had a couple quick thoughts, and then I'll try to shoot over some really quick questions. I do think this whole strategy and question around conversions that you both brought up in different ways is a really important, I think, a direction that the broader worker co-op movement is going. A lot of us, including myself, have been involved in doing startup worker co-ops, and the beauty of that is you get to conceive of the product or the service that you want to offer and making sure that it's something that your community needs, and it sort of requires for the worker owners to be involved in that process from the get-go, and so there's a higher likelihood of true ownership and control. But the reality is that, Kristen, as you said, we only have 400 or 500 worker-owned businesses in the country, and we really need to start talking at much bigger scales. And so, I'm really excited that in Boston we're currently exploring a potential conversion strategy. And actually, we, as with Boston Impact, as a private equity investor, similarly in the ways that you're talking about with some of the VC money, Nathan, we're interested. We're not trying to make 10x returns, 20x returns as VC does. We just want to make sure that the principle is intact and that we're able to do something, catalytic with our resources. And so we are looking at different tech businesses and also looking at local, manufacturing, for example, food manufacturing, in which we might be able to take a share of the equity and then exit by selling our equity to the workers over time to facilitate a worker ownership conversion. So there's, I'm just sharing that as another emerging strategy that I'm hearing more people talk about on how do we think about conversions and how do we think about the role of other kinds of capital. There's no reason, for example, that again, like if a union investor was able to be a little bit more flexible, recognizing those constraints that we do have to protect people's savings and the retirement money, but thinking about converting and taking over factories and turning them into union worker co-ops could also be a possibility. And the other thing that I want to flag is just the importance of this idea of the democratic ownership piece. And so, like in Boston, we've been able to do a few things around facilitating direct public offerings, which is sort of a more concrete example that some people might know about, but I just wanted to share that this is a live tool that people can use. I know that there are some folks, for example, in Buffalo, who are starting to think about how to use some community-driven capital raising to help build out some of their worker co-op stuff. In Boston, there's a pretty well-known co-op called Cero that used a direct public offering and sold 340,000 K in shares to community owners and used that to help capitalize their really exciting green composting business. So, it's interesting how some of the more mainline sort of co-op conversations and strategic conversations continue to have those themes sort of reverberate in these more, and I would say some of these newer models that you guys are building. All right, so I wanted to shoot over a quick question first to you, Kristen, from the crowd. There was just a quick question: what kind of reaction is there from union leadership to the forming of union cooperatives? That obviously the unions are not a monolith, but there's certainly a pretty hierarchical leadership at the national level, and so I'm also curious, like, are people excited about this? Is there still division? Are people coming around? If you could share anything without getting in trouble, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's not a monolith. And so I think it's different. I mean, I think there's some natural skepticism that exists. So some of the unions have been through employee stock ownership plans that weren't democratic at all, and so kind of got turned off from employee ownership in that particular way. So it's about reapproaching. Also, I think it's also about dealing with an attitude that, again, like when we look at the 400 or 500, it's so it's like about saying is this really, can this really make a difference? Can we really grow this? But I would say what I think excites me is that in Cincinnati at this point, again, and this is after we studied it, a group of 4 of us throughout 2010, then we said in 2011, hey, there's really something here. And so we started making connections, but now, I mean, on our board, we have the head of our labor council, we have the head of the labor council of the AFL-CIO in Ohio, we have the head of the building trades. We have the head of the Steelworkers District 1. We have the CWA is so excited about. The UFCW has actually given us staff time, as has the CWA. So I think it's about it's something that we have to build and kind of demonstrate success. But I think the more that's happening everywhere and the more people know about it, I just think it'll shift. But it's a process. I mean, it's definitely about building relationships, expanding the idea of what this is all about, connecting, and then, showing something. So
Amazing. Making the road while we walk.
There you go.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. Okay, so Nathan, I have another quick question for you. So somebody asked that, a lot of these platforms like Airbnb or TaskRabbit, that work is actually being held in people's homes, like as individuals, and that a lot of the cooperative culture has really been facilitated by having heart-to-heart, face-to-face relationships between worker owners. And so the question is essentially, how do you sort of keep that spirit of cooperatives and the ability for people to be in meaningful democratic decision-making when the actual workplaces that they're participating in actually don't bring them together necessarily?
That's a great question. I think it's really, really vital here. One way of framing it is, how do you take the weak ties that the internet provides us with and make them into the strong ties that real cooperativism requires? And I learned a lot about this from the Catalan Integral Cooperative. If you want to read more, there's an article I wrote for Vice magazine about it earlier this year. And one thing that, I asked them, they're a few hundred miles away from Mondragon. I asked them, so are you really influenced by that model? And they said, oh, no, not at all. That's so 20th century. That's not what we're doing at all. We don't want to create factories where we all go to work from 9 to 5 together and have like jobs. That's the worst. Interestingly, a lot of these folks were eager to do work that they found meaningful and contributing, but not to define themselves by their work. And so actually a lot of their activity together is non-work activity. Many of them are working independently, doing different kind of gig economy things that this network actually enables them to do economically. But the things they do together are like come together every week for the farmers market, where they can use their internal currency to pay for vegetables, or living together. So in many cases, actually, they're doing the togetherness stuff outside of work, and at the same time, they're building a structure, a legal and economic structure that enables them to be more independent, more kind of freelancey workers in ways that in the legal system in Spain is kind of difficult.
Very cool, thank you. Say the name of the organization or the region that.
Sure, it's the Catalan Integral Cooperative, and
okay, cool.
And I think it points to the way in which platform cooperatives are going to lead us to a different way of thinking about work and of categorizing life and work.
Awesome. So I could imagine some of my labor friends freaking out a little bit as you're talking about this, and I think it's such a amazing. So speaking of we having because there's such an effort to preserve the integrity of work is one that people talking about stable shifts and sort of and then meanwhile I do think there's a fundamental question around how we conceive of our labor and what should be, for example, met through market operations, what other things we can do for ourselves. And so I think it's an amazing opportunity in this conversation, for example, to hold both of these, that yes, we know that the ways in which that multinational corporations and sort of new labor laws are degrading people's sense of what work used to be and ought to be, and at the same time not running from the possibility of reconceptualizing. I'm glad your light turned back on. Rethinking how the economy fundamentally should be structured and how to distribute ownership and control beyond maybe just the individual firm, for example. So, obviously it's a much larger and richer conversation. We are just about out of time, but I did want to ask you all to just leave us with a final thought, if that's all right. And so I guess, given that we're sort of holding both of these models in conversation, I would love for you to talk about, each of you to say how you imagine that either the platform cooperativism movement might be relevant or useful for the union co-ops, and how the union co-ops might be, relevant and to the platform cooperativism. And Nathan, you already referenced some possibilities, so maybe you could just be more specific. So if y'all could just give us a really short closing on that, and then I'll just do a few more housekeeping things, and we'll be wrapping up this amazing conversation. So why don't we start with you, Nathan, and then we'll go to Kristen. If that's all right.
Okay. Yeah. I think first of all, it's critical. I mean, institutional starting point. I think unions are really important, and I don't think it's antithetical to the old model of work. Unions themselves are having to rethink how they operate and how they approach the emerging workplace, and I think this is an opportunity to dig in and to approach the economy in a less reactive fashion. To present a different model, a model that can be exciting to people. And what has been wonderful to find is that actually unions are doing this really, really well. Some of the most innovative ideas for cooperative platforms, I can't talk about all of them in specific because some of them are still yet to be unveiled. But there are some really exciting ideas coming out of unions right now, and that to me is a tremendous opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Nathan. How about you, Kristen?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to me, they overlap pretty seamlessly. I also am familiar with some, and have talked with some folks in unions who have some really exciting platform ideas that they're trying to work out and would be really creative and could spread across the country. And so I think it's just a pretty seamless connection. That's how I see it.
Cool. Awesome. All right, well, I want to thank both of you, Kristen and Nathan, for joining us for this call. This was just really, really interesting, and I just appreciate the depth of thinking and the work that y'all are doing to build the field and build this movement. And so I want to thank you on behalf of the New Economy Coalition, which again is the proud sponsor of this panel. We will be having lots more amazing, exciting conversations throughout the week, both online as well as in many of your geographies. So make sure to check out the neweconomyweek.org website. And hope that you both have amazing conferences coming up. And I personally, and I'm sure all of our listeners, will be really excited to hear what comes out of your conversations. So, I'm being distracted because I was also reminded to remind folks that this video will be available very soon after we hang up for reviewing and sharing. So we hope that all of you out there will make sure to share it with your friends and family. All right, so thank you guys again. Keep building the power, and look forward to seeing you guys soon.